An iron shackle cinched around Brielle's left ankle, so cold that she couldn't tell whether what she felt was pain or numbness. She sat in a metal chair in the middle of an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Baltimore, her hands bound behind her back with plastic zip ties that bit deep into her wrists, while the smell of engine oil and damp concrete filled her lungs with every breath. Blood from the split in her lower lip trickled down her chin, the sharp metallic taste mixing with saliva she swallowed back down her throat. She didn't cry. She had run out of tears 6 months earlier, on the night she came home and found her younger brother's room stripped bare, with nothing left behind except a note for a $200,000 debt, folded neatly on the pillow like a farewell. Holden, 22 years old, addicted to gambling, gone without a trace, and Brielle, 27, a former night shift nurse who had sold everything she owned, had followed the last lead she had to this place, to the address scrawled inside the debt notebook she found at the bottom of an old cabinet in her brother's rented room. She knew it was dangerous ground. She went anyway, because when a woman has lost her mother, lost her home, lost everything, the only thing left holding her upright is the hope of finding the only sibling she has left in this world. But that lead was a trap. 2 men had been waiting in the shadows of the warehouse, grabbing her before she even had time to see their faces. They asked, "Where is Holden? Where is the money?" She had neither. They beat her, not brutally, only just enough to make her understand that in this world she didn't have the right to bargain. And now she sat there, a chain around her leg, blood on her face, alone in a warehouse where no one knew where she was. Then the sound of footsteps echoed from the back entrance. Heavy, slow, even, unhurried, as though the man belonged to every second of the night. The 2 men guarding her straightened at once, almost on instinct, their faces going hard. The steel door swung open. A man stepped inside, tall, dressed in a black coat, with no weapon visible. But the way everything in the room seemed to draw inward when he appeared said more than any gun ever could. He didn't look at the 2 guards. He looked at her, at the chain, at the bruise blooming across her cheekbone, at the way she didn't lower her head even though blood still slipped from her mouth. 5 seconds. 10 seconds. A silence stretched so long Brielle could hear water dripping somewhere in the warehouse. Then he turned to the man standing behind him, his voice flat as a frozen lake. "I don't remember authorizing this." Brielle didn't know who he was, but she knew one thing. When he said, "Take off the chain, put her in my car," the 2 men who had just beaten her didn't dare ask a single question, and that was more frightening than everything that had come before, because Brielle didn't know whether she had just escaped a trap or stepped into the hands of someone 100 times more dangerous. His name was Soren Cade, the boss of the Mafia organization that controlled the underground network stretching from Baltimore to Philadelphia, and from this moment on, her fate rested in the hands of the man the entire city didn't dare speak of by name. Do you think Brielle should trust Soren, or has she just walked into the most dangerous trap of her life? If you'd like to hear what happens next, please hit like so I'll know. Share this with someone else who loves stories like this, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next part. The black car glided through the streets of Baltimore in silence. Soren sat behind the wheel, his eyes fixed straight ahead, not speaking a single word from the moment they left the warehouse. Brielle sat in the passenger seat, her back pressed tight against the door, keeping as much distance as she could in the cramped space. Her left ankle throbbed with every beat of her pulse, the wound where the chain had cut into her skin still seeping blood through the fabric of her pants. She didn't look at him. She looked out through the window instead, memorizing every turn, every sign, every street name, slipping past beneath the murky yellow streetlights, left at North Avenue, right at Charles Street, straight through Inner Harbor. If she needed to run, she needed to know the way back. The car stopped in front of an old building at the edge of the Harbor District, its red brick facade faded and dull, with no sign out front and no guard in the lobby. Soren killed the engine, stepped out, and walked straight inside without turning back to see whether she followed. Brielle stayed in the dark car for 3 more seconds, weighing her choices. Then she opened the door, because sitting alone in a car in the middle of Baltimore at night wasn't a choice either. The elevator was old, the fluorescent light overhead flickering as it carried them up to the 14th floor. Soren opened the penthouse door with a key card, stepped inside, and turned on the lights. Brielle stood at the threshold and looked in. The apartment was large, but so empty it felt cold. White walls with no paintings, dark wooden floors with no rugs, furniture sparse enough to count, One gray sofa, one dining table with 2 chairs, bookshelves covering an entire wall, and in the corner of the living room, a black piano with a thin layer of dust lying across its lid. No family photographs, no decorations, no trace that anyone else had ever lived there. The place looked more like a cell than a home, except prison cells were usually warmer. Soren pointed toward the hallway. The last room on the right. There's a bed. There's a bathroom. The door doesn't lock from the outside. The elevator runs 24 hours. Then he went into his own room and shut the door. No good night. No further explanation. Brielle stood alone in the silent penthouse, listening to the air conditioner hum steadily like the house breathing. She went into the room he had indicated and locked the door from the inside with the latch. A single bed, a white blanket, an empty closet, a small bathroom with hot water. She checked every corner, because 6 months of clinging to survival on the streets had taught her never to trust a strange room. No camera hidden in the outlets, no lock on the outside of the door. The window could be opened, but 14 floors below was nothing except concrete. She went into the bathroom, tore a towel into long strips, and washed the wound on her ankle with hot water. The skin where the chain had torn into her was raw and swollen. The blood dried into a crust, but beneath it the flesh still leaked. She wrapped it tight with the instinct of a nurse, her hands still skillful even though she hadn't stood in an emergency room in 6 months. Then she lay down on the bed without changing clothes, without turning off the light, her shoes still on. If something happened in the night, she needed 3 seconds to get to her feet, not 10. Sleep didn't come. She lay there listening to every sound through the wall. The water running through the pipes, the wind whining beyond the window. One soft set of footsteps only once, then nothing. Around 4 in the morning, exhaustion defeated everything else, and she drifted off. When Brielle opened her eyes, sunlight had already filtered through the thin curtains. She sat upright at once, her heart pounding, needing 2 seconds to remember where she was. When she stepped into the living room, the penthouse was empty. Soren was gone. On the kitchen counter, a cup of coffee still warm sat beside a handwritten note, the penmanship neat and slanted. First aid kit in the top drawer on the left. There's food in the fridge. I'll be back before evening. She stood looking at the note for 10 seconds. He wasn't watching her. He had left her here alone all day, with the door unlocked and the elevator running. She found the first aid kit and treated the wound on her ankle properly for the first time, with betadine, sterile gauze, and medical tape. Then she started walking through the penthouse, not out of curiosity, but assessment. The shelves lined wall to wall with books, philosophy, war history, economics, not a single novel. The liquor cabinet held 4 expensive bottles of whiskey, but only one had been opened, and even that one was still nearly full. He didn't drink much. The kitchen was clean, but the refrigerator was nearly empty, the kind of food a man living alone kept for himself. Eggs, cheese, dried noodles, jarred sauce, and in the office, the desk drawer wasn't locked, and inside it lay a photograph turned face down. She touched it, then pulled her hand back. Not yet. She didn't yet know what she wanted to know about him. That evening, the lock clicked. Soren stepped inside, set a bag of groceries on the counter, didn't look at her, and began to cook. Pasta, tomato sauce from a jar. Garlic added in. The smell of garlic sizzling spread through the cold penthouse. He set down 2 plates, sat across from her, and ate. Silence. He didn't ask whether she had slept well, whether she was hurting, whether she needed anything. Brielle finished the plate because her stomach had been empty since yesterday. When she set her fork down, she looked straight at his face for the first time under the kitchen light. I won't thank you. You didn't take me out of that warehouse out of kindness. You did it for your own reasons. Soren looked back at her, not angry, not defensive, his eyes as calm and flat as a man who had heard every kind of accusation, until none of them stirred a reaction anymore. Right. One word, no explanation, no defense, and that naked honesty startled her more than any promise could have. She washed her own plate and went back to her room, not as thanks, only out of habit. But that night, around 11, when the penthouse had gone dark and she lay on the bed with her eyes open, she heard his voice through the wall, low, cold, sharp as a blade being honed on stone. Corbin, she's not merchandise. I decide this, not you. Silence. Then, if you want to sell her to Markov, then you can explain to me why you think you ever had that right. More silence. This conversation ends here, the sound of the phone being set down on the table. Then nothing. Brielle lay rigid on the bed, her heart hammering. She didn't understand everything, but she understood enough. Corbin, the name she had heard back at the warehouse, wanted to sell her to someone named Markov. Soren had refused, but that struggle had still taken place between two men, over her, and not one of them had asked her a single question. She lay in the darkness, her ankle throbbing, and understood more clearly than ever what she was in this place. She was the thing being fought over, not the person being protected. And if she wanted to change that, she'd have to find her own way. On the morning of the third day, Brielle woke and lay still for 10 minutes, staring at the ceiling before making her decision. She had spent 2 days watching, searching, memorizing. She knew the penthouse had no outside lock. She knew the elevator worked. She knew Soren left early every morning and no one stood guard over her. Today she would try the one thing she hadn't tried yet, stepping outside. She washed her face, rewrapped her ankle, put on the only pair of shoes she had left, their soles worn thin, then walked straight to the penthouse door. The elevator carried her down 14 floors. The doors opened. The lobby stood empty. No guard, no camera she could clearly see. She stepped out onto the street. No one stopped her. No one called after her. No one followed. The November wind in Baltimore sliced through her thin jacket, cold enough that she folded her arms across her chest and still shivered. She walked north, 1 block, then 2. She limped because her ankle was still swollen beneath the bandage, but she clenched her teeth and kept going. She wanted to know what freedom felt like after 3 days inside an apartment on the 14th floor. She wanted to know whether she could leave or not. The answer came faster than she expected. She stood at the corner of Pratt and Light, looked around, and realized she had nothing. No money, because her wallet had been taken at the warehouse that night. No phone, because it had shattered when the 2 men grabbed her. No identification, because everything had been in the backpack she carried when she came to Baltimore, and by now it was probably still lying somewhere in that warehouse or had already been thrown away. She stood in a city of 400,000 people, and not one of them knew she existed. She could keep walking. To where? Back to what? She had given up her old apartment in the suburbs 3 months earlier, when she could no longer afford the rent. She had no friends left, because she had cut ties with everyone when she began searching for Holden, unwilling to drag anyone else into the trouble. The only family she had left was Holden, and Holden was somewhere she couldn't find. Maybe alive, maybe not. She stood on that freezing Baltimore sidewalk, her leg aching, her stomach empty, and understood the cruelest truth of all. Freedom is an open door with nothing behind it. She could step through it and freeze to death out on the street. Or she could go back to the penthouse on the 14th floor where, at the very least, there was hot water, a first aid kit, and 4 walls. She turned back. Not because Soren was keeping her, not because she was afraid, because she was practical, and practical people choose survival first, then figure out the rest later. The elevator carried her back up to the 14th floor, and the penthouse door was unlocked. She stepped inside and saw that Soren had returned earlier than usual. He stood in the kitchen with his back to her, pouring hot water into a cup. He didn't turn when he heard her come in. He didn't ask where she had gone. He didn't say, "I knew you'd come back." He only set a cup of hot tea on the kitchen counter, about an arm's length away from her, then walked into his office. He didn't hand it to her. He didn't pull out a chair and invite her to sit. He simply left it there. If she wanted it, she could take it, and if she didn't, she could leave it alone. Brielle looked at the cup of tea steaming on the gray counter. She knew he had known she went outside. Perhaps he had known from the beginning. Perhaps he had some way of keeping track that she hadn't seen. Or perhaps he had simply guessed. But he hadn't stopped her, hadn't blamed her, hadn't used it as a way to remind her that she depended on him. He had let her go, let her see, let her come back on her own. And that unsettled her more than a locked door would have, because it forced her to admit that staying had been her choice, not his. She took the cup of tea, drank it standing up, not sitting down, as though sitting would mean accepting something she still wasn't ready to accept. That night, after dinner, silent as every dinner had been, she didn't go back to her room right away. She stayed at the kitchen table, watching him wash the dishes, and asked him the question she had swallowed for 3 days. What am I here? A guest. A hostage. Bait. Why are you keeping me here? Soren turned off the water, dried his hands on a towel, and looked back at her. He didn't sit down. He leaned against the counter, his arms folded over his chest. His voice was flat, no gentler, and no harder than it always was. Your brother owes my organization $200,000. You don't. But Corbin, the man you saw in the warehouse, sees you as a replacement asset. He wants to hand you over to Yevgeny Markov, who runs the network on the eastern side of Baltimore Harbor, to clear Holden's debt. Markov won't treat you like a guest. He paused, giving her time to absorb it. Then he went on. I refused. But Corbin isn't a man who takes no for an answer. Right now you're caught in the middle. Corbin wants you. Markov wants you. And I won't hand you over. If you go outside alone right now, Corbin will know, and this time he won't chain you to a chair and wait for me to arrive. Brielle listened, her gut tightening in hard, painful knots. She wanted to shout in his face that none of this was her fault, that she had come to Baltimore looking for her brother, not asking for a ticket into an underworld where human lives were bartered like currency. But she swallowed the anger, because anger wouldn't change the reality of her situation. So she asked the only question that remained. Then what's your plan? Soren was silent for 3 seconds. I don't have one yet. That honesty was cold as ice, but at least it wasn't an empty promise. He didn't say, I'll protect you, or everything will be fine. He told the truth, that he didn't yet know what he was going to do with her. Brielle stood, pushed her chair back in under the table. She looked at him one last time before turning toward her room, and spoke slowly, one word at a time. If you don't have a plan yet, then I'll find my own. I'm not going to sit here waiting for other people to decide my fate. I've been doing that for 6 months already, waiting for Holden to come back, waiting for the next lead, waiting for someone to tell me whether my brother is still alive or not. I'm tired. Soren didn't answer. He only watched her walk into the hallway, heard the door to her room close, not slammed, only shut firmly enough. And in the empty kitchen, he remained standing there for a long while, looking at the chair where she had just been sitting, before he finally turned out the light. 2 days after saying, I'll find my own way, Brielle still hadn't found one. She spent her time moving through the penthouse, practicing how to put weight on the ankle that was slowly healing, eating whatever was in the refrigerator, and thinking. Soren left early and came back late, just as he always did, and the two of them exchanged no more than 10 sentences each evening. Most of them nothing more than there's food in the fridge and I know. But the 5th night was different. Brielle was lying on the bed at 1 a.m, her eyes closed but sleep still far from her, when a knock came at her bedroom door. Not loud, not urgent, but firm enough for her to know it wasn't a mistake. She sat up at once, her feet touching the cold floor, and opened the door. Soren stood in the hallway, the sleeves of his shirt rolled up, blood smeared across his forearm. Not his blood, she saw that immediately. The blood had already dried at the edges, streaked from elbow to wrist, the kind that came from someone else rather than from one of his own wounds. His voice was calm, but faster than usual. I've got someone injured in the basement. A stab wound to the abdomen, heavy bleeding. My doctor is in Philadelphia, 2 hours away. You're a nurse. It wasn't a question. It was circumstance. Brielle stood in the doorway for 2 seconds, looking at the blood on his arm, then at his eyes. Then she said, I need bright light, boiling water, surgical sutures if you have them. If not, then regular needle and thread, betadine or rubbing alcohol, sterile gauze, gloves. Take me down. Soren nodded and turned, walking ahead of her. The elevator descended to the basement, and when the doors opened, they stepped into a room of bare concrete, fluorescent lights glaring white overhead, the smell of mildew mixing with the metallic sting of blood. On a long wooden table lay a man on his back, his skin gray with shock, sweat soaking his forehead, one hand clamped over his stomach while blood seeped through his fingers. Remy, around 30, broad-shouldered, but now his face twisted tight with pain, his breathing quick and shallow. 2 other men stood nearby, their faces tense, not knowing what to do. Brielle didn't look at them. She went straight to the table, pulled Remy's hand away from the wound, and bent over to examine it. A stab wound beneath the right rib cage, deep but clean, a narrow blade, not serrated. The blood flowed steadily but didn't spurt, which meant no major artery had been hit. She pressed her hand around the abdomen near the wound. Remy groaned, and she said shortly, Lie still. I need to check whether the bowel's been perforated. His abdomen was soft, not rigid, not distended. A good sign. She turned to Soren. Sutures, betadine, gauze. Right now. He had already prepared a supply box on the chair beside the table. She opened it. Inside was enough basic equipment, not what she would have had in an emergency room, but enough to save a life if the hands doing the stitching were skilled enough. She cleaned her hands with alcohol, pulled on gloves, and began to work. 30 minutes. She stitched in absolute silence, with nothing in the room but Remy's heavy breathing and the sound of the needle passing through skin. 12 stitches. Even. Secure. Spaced exactly right. She stopped the bleeding, disinfected the wound, and bandaged it. Then she checked his pulse, his blood pressure by hand, his pupils. Remy was alive. His skin was still pale, but his pulse had steadied, and the bleeding had stopped. She pulled off the gloves, threw them into the trash, and washed her hands again. When she turned back, she caught Soren looking at her. He had stood in the corner of the room for those full 30 minutes, silent, watching. Not watching Remy, watching her. Watching the way her hands moved, the way she gave clipped orders, the way she took control of a chaotic situation that none of the 3 men in the room had been able to manage. For the first time since meeting her in that warehouse, his eyes didn't rest on her the way a man looks at a problem that needs solving. He looked at her the way a man looks at someone he has underestimated. The elevator carried them back up to the 14th floor. They stood in the kitchen while Soren washed the blood from his forearm beneath the running water, and Brielle leaned back against the counter, her ankle aching, her hands trembling slightly as the adrenaline drained out of her. She watched the water run red, then clear, and said in a level voice, "That man, Remy, what was he doing when he got stabbed?" Soren didn't turn around. Collecting a debt. Meaning he went to someone's house to demand money, and they stabbed him because they didn't have it to give, or because they didn't want to pay. I wasn't there. But you sent him. Yes. Brielle looked down at her own hands. The yellow stain of betadine still caught between her fingers. I just saved the life of a man who may have broken someone's arm tonight, or threatened someone's family, or worse. Soren turned off the water, dried his hands, and looked back at her. Not angry, not ashamed, not defensive. Yes, one word. The third time she had heard that word from his mouth, and this time it landed heavier than the two before it. Because now she wasn't just the woman sitting across from him eating pasta. She had just become part of his machine with her own 2 hands. She hadn't saved Remy because Remy deserved saving. She had saved him because she was a nurse, and nurses don't let people die under their hands. But the line between professional instinct and complicity was thinner than she had imagined. She swallowed the nausea rising up her throat, not because of the blood, but because of the realization. Then she said the thing she had wanted to say from the first day. I saved your man. Now you give me what I need. I want everything you have on my brother. Every transaction, every contact, every camera recording, every person Holden ever spoke to in your organization. All of it. Soren looked at her, and she saw something in his eyes shift. Not softness, because he wasn't a soft man, but recognition. She had just placed a piece on the board, and he respected the move. Tomorrow morning, he said. Then he turned off the kitchen light and walked away. Brielle stayed there a moment longer in the dark, listening to the sound of his bedroom door closing, and thought that tonight, for the first time since arriving in this penthouse, she wasn't the one who only knew how to wait anymore. She had just traded 30 minutes and 12 stitches for the one thing she needed most. Information about Holden. And she wasn't going to waste it. Soren kept his word. The next morning, when Brielle stepped into the living room, he was already seated at the dining table. Laptop open, a cup of coffee set in front of her. He didn't say good morning. He didn't ask whether she had slept well. He only turned the laptop toward her and said, "This is everything I have." Brielle sat down, pulled the laptop closer, and began to read. The folder named Holden Ashford contained everything, arranged in chronological order, neat in a way that felt almost cold, like the medical charts she used to read at the hospital, except the patient here was her brother, and the illness was gambling. The first file was the transaction history from Cade's organization gambling app. Holden had started playing 10 months earlier. Small bets at first. $20, $50, the kind a man makes when he's trying his luck after work. Then the amounts climbed. 100, 500, 1,000. By the 6th month, Holden had placed a $3,000 bet in a single night and lost every cent. That was where the borrowing began. The first $20,000, interest 3 times higher than a bank, due in 30 days. Holden couldn't pay. The debt multiplied. 20 became 40. 40 became 80. 80 became 160. By the time she saw the final number, $200,000, she understood why Holden had vanished. No one carries a debt like that on a waiter's wages. Brielle read every line, her face expressionless, but her fingers tightened around the edge of the table until her knuckles blanched white. Every transaction was a piece of her brother's life she had never known. Nights when she was working 12-hour shifts at the hospital, Holden was sitting in front of a phone screen burning through the money she had earned. She scrolled down to the next section, security footage. The video had been recorded in an underground gambling room in Fells Point, Baltimore, a basement beneath a laundromat, yellow lights, poker tables, cigarette smoke. Holden appeared in 3 separate clips over the course of 2 weeks, and each time he looked worse than the last. In the first clip, he was still smiling, placing chips with confidence. In the second, his eyes were hollow, his shirt wrinkled, his leg bouncing non-stop beneath the table. In the third clip, the last one, Holden wasn't playing. He was standing in the corner of the room, talking to a tall man with closely cut hair and a gray suit. A man Brielle recognized immediately, even though she had never truly seen his face clearly before. Corbin Voss. She recognized him by the way he stood, by the tilt of his head when he spoke, exactly like the shadowed figure standing behind Soren in the warehouse that night. In the video, Corbin said something. Holden nodded, and then the two of them disappeared out of frame. After that clip, there was nothing. No camera captured Holden anywhere else within Cade's system. Brielle turned to the final section, tracking data. No bank card transactions after that day. No calls from his registered phone number. No social media activity. No bus, train, or airline tickets booked. Holden Ashford, 22 years old, had vanished from every system as though he had never existed at all. Brielle closed the laptop slowly, both hands resting flat on the table. She looked straight at Soren, her eyes dry, no tears in them, but her voice trembled slightly at the end of the question. "What do you think?" Soren sat across from her, his coffee still untouched, his eyes having watched her from the moment she started reading. He answered slowly, choosing each word. "People who run from debt still leave traces. They use a card in another city, call someone they know from a new number, book a ticket under a false name but still use an old email address. Human beings don't know how to disappear completely. Instinct keeps them connected." "But your brother left nothing. 6 months, not a single trace." He paused, looking at her, weighing whether he should say more. Then he did. "People who run leave a trail. People who are hidden don't." The sentence landed on the table with the weight of a bullet. Brielle understood the implication immediately. Holden hadn't disappeared on his own. Someone had hidden him, or worse. And the last person seen beside Holden on camera was Corbin Voss. Anger rose from her stomach, hot and sharp, swallowing the patience she had spent 5 days trying to gather. She shot to her feet, her chair scraping across the wooden floor. "I want to see Corbin, right now. I want to look him in the eye and ask what he did to my brother." Soren didn't stand. He didn't raise his voice. He remained seated, looking at her, and said in a tone as flat as the tabletop, "If you go to Corbin now, you tell him 2 things. First, that you know he was the last person to see Holden. Second, that you're with me and I'm giving you information. He'll use both. He'll erase whatever trace of Holden might still be left, if there is one, and he'll use you to pressure me. You lose the only advantage you have, which is that Corbin thinks you're just a foolish hostage who doesn't know anything." Brielle stood in the middle of the living room, her fists clenched, her breathing quick and shallow. She hated him in that moment. Hated the way he sat there calmly analyzing while her brother might be dying somewhere. Hated the way he was always right with that cold logic that left no room for emotion. But she also knew, deep in her gut, that he was right. If she rushed at Corbin in anger, she would lose everything. She had lost Holden once already because she hadn't seen the signs. She couldn't lose him again because of a reckless move. She sat back down, slowly, as though every joint in her body resisted it. She looked at Soren, and in her eyes was something no single word could fully name. Anger, gratitude, disgust, respect, all of it at once. "Then what do I do?" she asked, her voice low. "You wait, and you let Corbin keep thinking you don't matter. That's the best shield you have right now." Brielle didn't answer. She pulled the laptop back toward her, opened it again, and began reading from the beginning. This time more slowly, memorizing every detail, every date, every number. If she had to wait, then she would wait armed. And her weapon was information. On the 7th day, Brielle woke before Soren for the first time. She lay there listening to the sound of him shifting once through the wall, then stillness, then the even rhythm of his breathing settling again. He was still asleep. She stepped into the kitchen in the pale gray light filtering through the curtains, opened the refrigerator, and looked at the things inside that she already knew by heart after a week: eggs, cheese, butter, sandwich bread, sauce, dried noodles. She took out the eggs, the butter, and the bread. She didn't know why she was doing this. No one had asked her to. Soren had never once suggested that she should cook, had never once pushed the role of homemaker toward her, not even with a glance. But this morning, after a week of eating whatever he made, or scavenging cold food from the refrigerator herself, after a night of reading Holden's file over and over until her eyes burned, she needed to do something with her hands that had nothing to do with blood or pain. She needed to remind herself that she was still an ordinary person, that she still knew how to beat eggs, still knew how to watch the heat so the butter wouldn't burn, still knew how to flip bread at exactly the moment it turned golden and crisp. The smell of melted butter and frying eggs drifted through the cold penthouse. Soren stepped out into the living room just as she was setting the plates down, his hair slightly tousled, a gray t-shirt on, bare feet against the floor. It was the first time she had seen him look like an ordinary man instead of a mafia boss. He stopped in the doorway of his room, looked at the table, the 2 plates of eggs, the toast, the 2 cups of coffee, then looked at her. He didn't say anything. He only looked. She didn't explain. She simply sat down and started eating. He sat across from her, picked up his fork, and ate. Silence, like every meal before it. But this silence was different. It wasn't the silence of 2 strangers trapped together. It was the silence of 2 people sitting at the same table because they wanted to be there. When the plates were nearly empty, Brielle set down her fork and looked toward the window. The morning light over Baltimore slanted through the glass, laying a long, warm strip across the table. She didn't look at Soren when she began to speak, as though looking somewhere else made it easier to breathe. My mother found out she had cancer when I was 24. Stage 3, lung cancer. She had smoked for 30 years, but she was still shocked when she heard the diagnosis, as if she thought her body had become immune, simply because it was used to it. She stopped and drew in a breath. I paid the hospital bills for 3 years, worked nights, sometimes double shifts, slept 4 hours between them if I was lucky. Holden was 19 then, waiting tables, but his paycheck barely covered gas, let alone hospital bills. I told him to take care of himself and let me take care of Mom. I thought that was how I was protecting him. She gave a small laugh with no joy in it, the kind of laugh that belongs to someone looking back at a mistake that now seems glaringly obvious, though it was invisible at the time. But the truth is, I abandoned Holden by being too busy trying to save my mother. I worked nights. He lived at night. We were in the same house and still went 3 or 4 days without seeing each other. I left rent money on the table. He took it, and neither of us said a word. When my mother died, it took me 6 months just to sleep normally again, and by the time I finally looked up, Holden had turned into someone I didn't recognize. Soren sat still through all of it. He didn't nod as if offering sympathy. He didn't interrupt with some useless "I understand." He only listened, coffee in his hand, eyes on her but not probing. When she finished, the silence stretched for 5 seconds, then 10. Then he said one thing, his voice flat, neither softer nor harder than it always was. "You aren't responsible for other people's choices, not even your brother's." Brielle looked at him. The words weren't comforting. They weren't warm. They weren't the kind of thing a friend would say. But they were true. True in the cruel way truth so often is. She didn't answer. She only gave the smallest nod, almost invisible, then stood and cleared the table. That afternoon, Brielle was reading through Holden's file for the 3rd time when she heard a soft click from the living room. She looked up. Soren was standing beside the piano, its lid now open, the dust on the white keys exposed beneath the late afternoon light. He stood there looking at the keys, his hands hanging at his sides, his fingers not touching them, like a man standing before a door he couldn't make himself walk through. She didn't know whether she should stay quiet or ask. In the end, she asked softly, not because she needed to know, but because the silence in that moment felt too heavy. "Do you play piano?" Soren didn't turn around. I used to. Then he closed the lid. Dust lifted into the air, then settled again. He walked away into his office and shut the door. 2 words. I used to. But the way he had stood in front of that piano, the way his fingers had almost touched the keys before drawing back, said more than those 2 words ever could. He had lost something tied to that instrument, some part of himself that this cold, silent penthouse had buried but never quite erased. She didn't ask anything more, but she remembered. That evening, after a rushed dinner of noodles and sauce, Brielle didn't go back to her room. She sat down on the living room sofa, folded one leg up beneath her, and opened a book she had taken from the shelf. Something about Roman history that she wasn't really reading, only using as an excuse to stay. Soren stepped out of his office 10 minutes later, saw her on the sofa, and paused for a beat. Then he sat down at the other end, 3 cushions away, picked up his own book, and read. He didn't ask why she hadn't gone back to her room. He didn't speak. The living room lamp glowed a muted yellow, pages turning softly, the low hum of the city far below on the 14th floor. The 2 of them sat in the same room, not because circumstance forced them to, not because either one needed something from the other, only because tonight, being alone in a closed room felt more exhausting to her than sitting here, and perhaps it did to him too. Neither of them said that aloud, but when Brielle finally stood and went back to her room, she said goodnight without thinking. Soren didn't look up from his book, but he answered, his voice quiet. You too. For the first time in that penthouse, there was something that felt almost normal. That night, after Soren said goodnight and she went back to her room, Brielle lay down but didn't fall asleep right away. She thought about the morning, about the way he had eaten the eggs she made, about the piano with its lid shut, about those 2 words, I used to. Maybe that was why she let her guard down. Maybe because after a week in this penthouse, she had begun to grow used to the strange rhythm the 2 of them had built. Silent meals, books on the sofa, just enough distance between them. She forgot who he was. But on the morning of the 9th day, the penthouse reminded her. Brielle woke early, stepped into the kitchen to make coffee, and heard Soren talking on the phone in his office. The door wasn't fully closed, left open by a crack, enough for his voice to carry through clearly. She didn't mean to listen, but she didn't walk away either. 3 months. He hasn't paid. He hasn't shown up. He hasn't answered his phone. I gave him 3 months. Corbin called that weakness, and this time I agree with Corbin. Silence. The person on the other end said something she couldn't hear. Then Soren went on, his voice flat as a tabletop, not angry, not sympathetic, nothing at all. Shut down his store. Tomorrow morning. Before opening. More silence. I don't care whether he has a family. I care whether he'll have the money by next month. And if he won't, then the store is the answer. The sound of the phone being set back on the desk. Brielle stood in the hallway, holding a cup of coffee she hadn't touched, gone cold in her hand. She walked quietly back to the kitchen, sat down, and drank the coffee without tasting any of it. She didn't say anything to Soren about the call that day. He left at 8, as he always did. She stayed behind, but her mind wouldn't stop turning. That afternoon she went outside, walking south with no destination in mind, just needing air. Soren had given her cash and a new phone on the 6th day, saying only, tools, not gifts, then walking away. She crossed 3 blocks, then 4, and turned onto a narrow street in Highlandtown she had never seen before. And there it was. A small grocery store, the kind of family place open from morning to night, selling everything from milk to batteries. The glass front had been shattered, broken pieces scattered across the sidewalk, and glittering in the afternoon light like fragments of metal. The shelves inside had been overturned, canned goods, bottles, bags of flour, all of it strewn across the floor. The open sign hung crooked from a door whose hinges had been kicked loose. In front of the store stood a man around 50, staring at the wreckage, his face drained white, both arms hanging uselessly at his sides, like someone who still couldn't understand what had happened, even while he was looking straight at it. Beside him, a woman, probably his wife, sat collapsed on the sidewalk, both hands over her face, her shoulders shaking. There was no loud crying, only the silent trembling of someone who had already used up every ounce of strength she had for screaming. Brielle stood across the street and looked. She didn't need anyone to confirm it. She knew exactly which store this was. She knew where the order had come from. She knew the flat voice that had said, "Shut down his store yesterday morning in the office just beyond the half-open door." She turned and walked away, faster than she had come, her ankle throbbing but not slowing her down. By the time she got back to the penthouse, Soren was already home. He stood in the kitchen, chopping onions for dinner, his back to her. Ordinary. As though giving the order to destroy one family's livelihood in the morning and standing here cutting onions to make dinner at night were two completely unrelated things. Brielle stopped in the doorway and looked at his back, then said, "I saw that store." Soren stopped cutting. He didn't turn right away. 2 seconds. Then he set the knife down, turned around, and looked at her. His eyes didn't shift away. He didn't look ashamed. He didn't search for some explanation. "Which store?" he asked, but his voice told her he knew exactly which store. The grocery store in Highlandtown. Broken glass, shelves wrecked, the owner standing outside like his soul had left his body, his wife crying on the sidewalk. She said each word clearly, without shouting, without trembling, only wanting him to hear every syllable. "I heard you give the order yesterday morning. Through the office door. Shut down his store. You said those exact words." Soren looked at her, and she waited. Waited for him to deny it. Waited for him to explain that the man had owed too much for too long, that it was the rules, that he had no choice. Anything at all that would let her keep sitting across from him every evening without feeling sick. But Soren didn't deny it. He didn't explain. He said, his voice steady, his eyes fixed on hers. "I didn't tell you to look away. You wanted to know who I am. That's part of it." The words hit her in the chest like a fist. Not because they were cruel, but because they were so honest they couldn't be argued with. He didn't pretend to be good. He never had. From the first day, his answers had always been yes, direct, bare, with no cushioning left for her to cling to. She went back to her room without eating dinner, closed the door, sat on the bed, and stared at the white wall. In her mind, 2 images turned over and over without stopping. Soren this morning, chopping onions, making dinner, his voice quiet when he said goodnight to her last night on the sofa, and Soren yesterday morning, his flat voice over the phone, giving the order to shatter a family's life without caring whether they had children or not. The same man, the same hands, the man who made breakfast for her without being asked, and the man who ordered the store of an old man without protection money to be destroyed. She lay awake until 3 in the morning, her eyes open in the dark, and that question kept drilling through her without end. Were those 2 people really the same? And if they were, then what exactly was she sitting on that sofa beside? 2 days after the store incident, Brielle still ate with Soren but said nothing beyond what was necessary. She didn't avoid him, because avoiding someone in a penthouse was childish, but she kept her eyes on her plate and kept conversation at absolute zero. Soren didn't push her to speak. He still cooked, still left her portion for her, still came and went early and late as always. If he noticed the change, he didn't show it, or maybe he knew and chose to let her work through it on her own. On the 11th night, the power went out. No thunder, no storm, just Baltimore and an aging electrical grid in November. The penthouse sank into complete darkness, and the city lights below died block by block along with it. Brielle stood in the middle of the living room, her eyes not yet adjusted, one hand sliding along the wall, trying to find her way. She needed candles or a flashlight, anything that could make light. She remembered seeing a box of matches in the kitchen, but couldn't recall which drawer. She felt her way into the kitchen, opened 2 drawers, found nothing. Then she remembered Soren's office, the desk drawer, where she had seen a small candle during that first week when she searched through the penthouse. She moved down the hallway and pushed open the office door. It wasn't locked. It never was. Weak moonlight slipped through the small window, enough for her to make out the edge of the desk, the outline of the chair, and the drawer. She pulled it open and felt around for the candle. Her fingers brushed paper, pens, a small matchbox, then the picture frame, the photograph lying face down, the one she had seen on the first day and hadn't turned over. This time, in the dark, her hand had already picked it up before her mind could remind her that she had once chosen not to look. She struck a match, and the small flame flared up, lighting the photograph in her hand. It was black and white, the edges yellowed slightly with age. On the left stood a middle-aged man, square-faced, hair combed back, wearing a dark suit, smiling the broad smile of a man accustomed to being obeyed. Beside him was a boy around 14, thin, dark-haired, looking straight into the camera without smiling. Brielle recognized those features at once. The jawline, the deep-set eyes, the way he stood upright without leaning into anyone. Soren, at 14. On the right side of the photograph, separated by a small gap, stood a family of 4. Father, mother, 2 children. The older around 10, the younger around 6. All 4 of them were smiling, the kind of smile people wear when they're taking a picture with the neighbors on a Sunday afternoon, suspecting nothing. On the back of the frame was a handwritten date, 22 years ago. She was still counting it in her head when the match burned out. Darkness fell again. Then footsteps sounded in the doorway. "You're looking for candles," Soren's voice. Not a question. He stood in the frame of the door, a dark shape inside the dark, holding a small flashlight angled toward the floor. The beam didn't point at her face, but it was enough for him to see the photograph in her hand. Brielle didn't hide it, didn't put it down. She stood straight, holding the picture, and waited. Waited for him to get angry, to snatch it back, or to ask what she was doing in his office. Soren did none of those things. He stepped inside, set the flashlight on the desk so the light bounced upward toward the ceiling, creating a weak glow, just enough for them to see each other's faces. He looked at the photograph, then at her, and sat on the edge of the desk. "You turned it over." "I did." Silence for 5 seconds. Then Soren spoke, his voice dry, like a man reading a report about something that had happened to someone else. "My father took this picture in the backyard of the Morrison family home. He considered them friends. Or rather, he considered Mr. Morrison useful. Morrison worked as an accountant for one of my father's shell companies. He knew every number, every flow of money." He stopped and drew in a breath. 2 weeks after this picture was taken, the FBI approached Morrison. He agreed to testify. My father knew within 48 hours. Brielle stood still, the photograph in her hand suddenly heavier than when she had first lifted it. My father didn't do it himself. He never did anything himself. He gave the order, and 2 other men carried it out. I was 14, standing in the upstairs hallway of our house, hearing the phone ring at 2 a.m, hearing my father say 4 words, "Take care of the Morrison family." The next morning, the news reported a house fire, 4 dead, including the 6-year-old child in the picture. His voice didn't shake, didn't catch. It stayed flat, the kind of flatness that belongs to someone who has lived with a memory for 22 years and worn it smooth by replaying it in his head until every sharp edge dulled. But his eyes weren't flat. In the weak flashlight glow, his eyes held something Brielle recognized because she had seen it in her own mirror for 6 months, the look of someone carrying guilt without knowing how to set it down. I didn't go into the room and stop my father. I didn't call the police. I didn't run outside. I stood in the hallway, listened, then went back to bed. The next morning I ate breakfast with him like always. Brielle looked down at the photograph. 4 smiling faces. The 6-year-old missing a front tooth, eyes narrowed against the sun. She wanted to set the picture down, but her hand wouldn't obey. She asked, more softly than she intended, "You've kept this photograph face down in your drawer for 22 years, so you wouldn't have to look at it, but you never threw it away." Soren looked at her. "If I forget, I become him." The words fell into the dark room like a cracked bell. Brielle placed the photograph on the desk, face up, the opposite of how she had found it, and didn't turn it face down again. She didn't know whether she had the right to do that, but she did it anyway. Then she picked up the candle she had been searching for, struck another match, lit it, and walked out of the room. She didn't say anything else. No comfort, no judgment, because she knew no words were large enough for a 14-year-old boy standing in a hallway, hearing his father order the deaths of 4 people and doing nothing. And she also knew that the boy in that hallway had grown into the man who ordered an old shopkeeper's store in Highlandtown destroyed. Both things existed at once. They didn't cancel each other out. They didn't explain each other away. He knew what he was. He chose limits, cut out drugs, kept gambling and protection rackets, didn't kill unless he was cornered. But he still lived in this world, still gave orders that shattered other people's lives in that same flat voice. There was no answer to that contradiction. And lying in bed that night, the candle burning on the windowsill, Brielle began to accept that it didn't need an answer, because she was no less contradictory herself. She was disgusted by his world, yet she was living in his penthouse, eating the food he bought, using the information he gave her. And she had stitched up one of his men at 1 a.m. She wasn't much more innocent than he was. She was only just beginning to realize it. On the 13th day, Brielle went out for the first time since seeing the store in Highlandtown. She needed air that didn't smell like the penthouse, didn't carry Soren's shadow, didn't hold the weight of the photograph that had once lain face down and now rested face up on the desk in his office. She walked east, 3 blocks, then turned into a small coffee shop on Fleet Street that she had passed several times but had never entered. The place was quiet, a weekday morning. Only a few people working on laptops and an older couple sitting by the window. She ordered black coffee and took the corner table in the back, her back to the wall, a habit she had taught herself since entering a world whose rules she still didn't fully understand. She had just lifted the cup to her lips when a woman pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. No permission asked. No smile. Around 45 years old, brown hair tied back neatly, gray blazer, no makeup, eyes sharp in the way of someone who had spent 20 years reading lies on other people's faces. She placed something on the table between their coffee cups. An FBI badge. Diane Purcell, federal agent. I know who you are, Miss Ashford. Brielle didn't touch her cup, didn't move. Her stomach tightened, but her face stayed flat. A lesson she had taught herself after nearly 2 weeks living with a man who never let emotion rise to the surface. I don't know who you are. Ma'am. Polite. Good. Purcell pulled the badge back and slipped it into the inner pocket of her jacket. I've been watching the Cade Syndicate for 3 years. RICO case. Do you know what RICO is? The law that lets us prosecute the whole organization, not just individuals. 3 years gathering evidence, 3 years of patience, 3 years of watching Soren Cade walk the streets like a king, while dirty money flows through 5 seafood restaurants from Baltimore to Philadelphia. Brielle listened without interrupting. Purcell continued, her voice softer now, the kind of softness that was carefully measured. 2 weeks ago, you walked into a warehouse outside the city, got chained up, got beaten, then Soren Cade personally took you out of there. Since then, you've been living on the 14th floor of a building near Inner Harbor, using a phone he bought, spending money he gave you, and coming and going freely. I know you're not a member of the organization. I know you came to Baltimore looking for your brother, Holden Ashford, 22 years old, in debt for $200,000, and missing for 6 months. Brielle kept her face still, but her stomach turned over. Purcell knew everything, or close to everything. What do I want? Purcell leaned forward. You're inside Soren Cade's home. You see who comes and goes. You hear his calls. You know who gets hurt and why. You have the one thing that 3 years of watching from the outside can't give me, a view from the inside. You give me information, and I give you 2 things. First, the full resources of the FBI to find Holden. Second, witness protection. A new identity. A new life. Away from Baltimore. Away from Cade. Away from all of it. Brielle looked at Purcell, looked at the badge now hidden in the woman's jacket, looked at those cold, patient eyes. She thought of Holden, his face gaunt in the security footage, disappearing after that conversation with Corbin. The FBI had resources she didn't. Databases, satellites, a federal network. If Holden was still alive, the FBI had a better chance of finding him quickly than anyone else. But she thought of Soren too. Of the silent plates of pasta, of the cup of coffee each morning, of the words you aren't responsible for other people's choices, of the photograph once kept face down, and the quiet sentence, if I forget, I become him. If she worked with the FBI, everything she gave them would be used to put him in prison. Every meal she had sat through with him, every call she had overheard through the wall, every night she had sat on the sofa reading 3 cushions away from him, all of it would become evidence. And she would become the traitor to the one person who was actually helping her look for Holden. I need time, Brielle said. Purcell studied her for 3 seconds, then nodded. You have time, but not much. A RICO case doesn't wait forever, and neither does my patience. She set a small card on the table, a phone number, no name, no title. Then she stood, put on her coat, and walked out like someone who had just finished a cup of coffee and had nothing worth mentioning. Brielle remained where she was, staring at the card, small, white, light, but heavier than everything else she was already carrying. She slipped the card into her jacket pocket, finished the rest of her coffee now gone cold, and walked back. On the way to the penthouse, her mind spun like a washing machine, cooperate with the FBI, and maybe find Holden, but betray Soren, refuse, and the FBI would come back, and next time Purcell wouldn't be offering coffee. And somewhere between those 2 choices, the image of the Highlandtown store returned again. Broken glass, crushed cans, the wife crying on the sidewalk. For the first time since hearing Soren talk about the Morrison family, she thought that maybe Purcell wasn't wrong. Maybe the world needed people like Purcell to stop men like Soren, and maybe she had been lying to herself in thinking that sitting on the sofa reading beside him every night was normal. She reached the penthouse in the afternoon. Soren was already home, sitting in his office with the door open. He looked up when she passed by, and she knew he read something on her face, because his eyes stayed on her a second longer than usual, moving from her eyes to the way she held her hands, the way she was walking faster than she had on other days. But he didn't ask. He only gave the slightest nod, then looked back at his laptop. She went to her room, closed the door, took the card back out, and stared at the line of numbers. Then she slid it into the drawer of her nightstand, beneath the Roman history book she had borrowed from the living room shelf. Her first piece on the board. She didn't know yet when she would play it, but she had it. 3 days after meeting Purcell, Brielle still hadn't called the number on the card. It lay in the drawer of her nightstand beneath the book, silent but heavy as a block of lead. Every night she opened the drawer, looked at it, then closed it again. Not yet, or maybe she still wasn't brave enough to decide when yet was. On the 16th night, she was sitting on the sofa reading at 11, and Soren still wasn't home. He had said that morning that he had a meeting that night, not with whom, not where. She hadn't asked, because she had already learned that in this penthouse, asking more didn't mean knowing more. 11:30, midnight, 12:30. She found herself reading the same page for the third time without realizing it. Then she heard the lock turn. Heavier than usual, unsteady. Like a man opening the door with one hand instead of two. The penthouse door swung open. Soren stepped inside. Brielle looked up, and the book fell from her hands. His black shirt was soaked from the left shoulder down across half his chest, and beneath the hallway light that wetness gleamed dark and thick. Blood. A lot of blood. His right hand was pressed hard against his left shoulder, fingers clamped tight, blood seeping through them and running down his forearm onto the wooden floor. His face was paler than usual, sweat beading across his forehead, but his eyes were still clear, still sharp. He made it 2 steps inside, then stopped, bracing his right shoulder against the wall, breathing hard. "Corbin," he said. One word, short. As if that explained everything, Brielle didn't need to hear more. Her body reacted before her mind caught up. 3 years of night shifts in the emergency room snapping on like a switch. She was beside him in 4 strides, her left hand catching his right wrist, her right hand pulling his hand away from the wound so she could see. Sit down. Sofa. Now. It wasn't the voice of the woman living in his penthouse. It was the voice of a night shift nurse, the kind of voice patients obey not out of politeness but instinct. Soren obeyed. He let her guide him to the sofa and lower him down, heavily. She ran into the kitchen for scissors, ran into the bathroom for the first aid kit, and was back in 40 seconds. She cut his shirt from the collar down to the shoulder, and the fabric fell open to reveal the wound. Entrance wound on the front of the left shoulder, about 3 fingers below the collarbone, edges burned, a small caliber round, probably a 9mm. She turned him forward and checked his back. Exit wound through the back of the shoulder, larger than the entrance. More blood there, though it had already begun to slow. The bullet had gone clean through. She pressed her fingers along the shoulder bone, the collarbone, the scapula. He clenched his teeth but didn't make a sound. Didn't hit bone, didn't hit the subclavian artery. If it had, you wouldn't have made it home. Did you drive yourself? I did, with one hand. Right hand. She didn't bother commenting on how insane that was. She took the betadine, soaked a gauze pad, and began to clean the wound. He sucked in a sharp breath when the antiseptic hit raw flesh, but his body didn't jerk. She looked at his eyes, pupils even, skin cold but not ashen, pulse at the wrist fast but steady. He had lost a lot of blood, but not enough yet to put him in immediate danger. She stitched, the front wound first, 4 neat, secure stitches. Then she leaned him forward again and stitched the exit wound. 6 stitches, harder because the tissue had torn wider there. Her hands were steady, each pass of the needle precise, but her breathing was shallower than it had been when she stitched Remy. That time it had been a stranger, one of his men, someone she hadn't known by name before. He lay bleeding on the table. This time it was Soren, the man who cooked pasta every night. The man who said yes without defending himself. The man who had kept a photograph face down for 22 years. Her fingers passed the needle through his skin, and she felt every strand of muscle beneath her fingertips. Warm, living, tightening with pain. She had never stitched someone whose coffee she could identify by smell every morning. She bandaged him. Thick gauze, compression wrap, secured with strips of cloth wrapped around his shoulder and across his chest. 15 minutes from the moment he had stepped through the door. When she tied the final knot, she sat back on the floor beside the sofa, his blood on her hands. The first aid kit exploded open around them, her breathing slowly settling back into rhythm. Soren lay on the sofa, eyes on the ceiling, chest rising and falling. The silence stretched. Then he turned his head and looked at her, his eyes strange, not grateful, not pained, but something she couldn't name, as if he were seeing her for the first time even after 2 weeks under the same roof. "You could have let me bleed out," he said, his voice rough from dehydration. "It would have been easier for you. Corbin loses me. You're free. Your brother becomes a debt no one collects. Everything solved." Brielle looked at him, her hands still sticky with his blood, stray gauze still scattered across her lap. She thought of the FBI card in the drawer beside her bed, thought of the store in Highlandtown, thought of the Morrison family in the photograph. He was right. Letting him bleed out would have been easier, simpler, cleaner. But she hadn't done it. Not because she forgave him, not because she needed him. "I'm a nurse," she said, her voice level. "I don't let people bleed." Soren looked at her for 3 seconds more. Then he closed his eyes, let his head fall back against the sofa, and his breathing gradually slowed. She stood up and went to wash her hands in the kitchen sink. His blood ran from her fingers, red, then pink, then clear. She looked at her hands beneath the water and realized what had changed, the thing she didn't want to admit. After stitching up Remy, she had washed her hands and gone to bed. This time, she washed her hands and came back to the sofa, took a blanket from her room, and laid it over him. Then she sat down in the chair across from him, without reading, without doing anything at all, simply watching his chest rise and fall until she was certain he wasn't going to stop breathing in the night. 4 days after the bullet, Soren still wasn't healed. His left shoulder was wrapped thickly, his arm suspended across his chest, in a sling Brielle had made by cutting strips from a bedsheet. He still left early, still came home late, but his face had gone grayer, his steps slower, and twice she saw him stop in the hallway and brace a hand against the wall for a few seconds, before moving again. She changed his bandages every morning, checked the stitches, cleaned the wound. He sat still and let her, never groaning, never thanking her, only nodding when she was finished, then getting up to put on his shirt with one hand. That rhythm lasted 4 days, almost normal. If normal meant a nurse bandaging a mafia boss every morning before he walked out the door to run a criminal organization. Then, on the 20th night, everything collapsed. Soren came home at 9 in the evening, earlier than usual, his face like stone. He set his phone down on the kitchen table, didn't look at her, and said 4 words. Corbin made his move. In the last 12 hours, Corbin Voss had seized 3 of the 5 front restaurants belonging to the Cade Syndicate along the East Coast. He had transferred control of the accounts, changed the locks, and put his own men in place of Soren's. At the same time, 3 of the most loyal men, Soren trusted, the ones who had been with him since he inherited the organization, turned and went over to Corbin. Money, men, territory, half the empire Soren had built over 9 years, gone in a single night. Soren said it in a flat voice, as if he were reading a grocery list. But his jaw was clenched so tight, Brielle could see the tendon standing out in his neck. He had lost half his organization while his shoulder still wasn't fully healed from the bullet Corbin himself had sent into him. But that wasn't the worst blow. Soren picked up the phone, opened a video, and set it in front of her. Corbin sent this with the message 2 hours ago. Brielle looked at the screen. The video was dark, lit only by the weak light of a single overhead bulb, the background raw gray concrete, and in the middle of the frame, sitting on a wooden chair, was Holden, her brother, alive. Brielle couldn't breathe. Her hands gripped the edge of the table until her knuckles went white. Holden sat there, so thin his cheekbones jutted like blades beneath his skin, eyes sunk deep in their sockets, dark circles bruising the flesh beneath them, hair grown long and damp with sweat. His t-shirt was torn at the collar, his jeans filthy. He looked into the camera, but his eyes weren't really seeing. The eyes of someone who had been in the dark too long for light to mean anything anymore. Holden didn't speak in the video. He only sat there, breathed, alive. but looking as if he were dying by inches. The video lasted 14 seconds, then ended. Brielle pushed the phone away and covered her face with both hands, her breathing sharp, hot, damp in her palms. She didn't cry. She wanted to cry, but her body refused, as if tears were a luxury she had used up long ago. She lowered her hands and looked at Soren. What did the message say? Soren answered, word by word. Turn over control of the organization. Turn over Brielle Ashford. Get Holden Ashford back. 3-day deadline. Silence. Then Brielle spoke, and her voice sounded strange to her own ears, shaking, and hard at the same time, like hot iron not yet cooled. Give me to Corbin. Trade me for Holden. Soren looked at her. No, this is my brother. I know. He's dying in that room. Look at his eyes. He won't survive another 3 months in a place like that. I know. Then give me to him. No. She shot to her feet, and the chair toppled backward and crashed onto the wooden floor. For the first time since coming to this penthouse, she shouted. Not the trembling voice of fear she had in the warehouse, not the flat voice she had learned after 2 weeks of living with him, but the voice of someone who had endured 6 months of losing her brother, losing her mother, losing her home, losing everything, and was now staring at her own brother, gaunt as a skeleton, on the phone screen of the Mafia boss whose gunshot wound she had stitched 3 days earlier. You don't get to decide this. He's my brother, my blood. Who are you to sit there and say no to me? Who the hell are you? Soren didn't stand up. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't flinch. He sat there, his right hand resting on the table, his eyes on her, and said nothing. That silence was crueler than any answer, because it forced her to hear her own scream echo through the empty penthouse, and realize it changed nothing. When the sound finally died, Soren spoke, his voice low and slow, not cold, but not warm either. Corbin won't keep his word. He'll take you, keep Holden, and use both of you to force me to hand over whatever I have left. Who do you think he lets go? What do you think Markov, the man he'll sell you to, will do with you? Do you want me to tell you in detail? Brielle stood in the middle of the living room, her fists clenched, her chest heaving, her eyes burning. She knew he was right. She hated that he was right. She hated the way his logic was always colder than her feelings. And she hated the way she couldn't argue with him because every word he spoke fit perfectly with everything she had already seen in this world. She didn't say another word. She turned, walked into her room, and slammed the door hard enough to shake the frame. Sitting on the bed, both hands on her knees, she looked at the drawer in the nightstand, opened it. The FBI card lay there, white, small, silent. She picked it up, her thumb moving across the line of numbers. 1 call. Purcell would answer. The FBI would come. Corbin would be found. Holden would be rescued. But if Corbin knew the FBI was coming, what would he do to Holden before they kicked the door in? The image of her brother on that wooden chair came back again, hollow-eyed, bones jutting, breathing but not truly living. If Corbin needed to erase evidence before the FBI arrived, Holden would be the first thing erased. She set the card down, picked it back up, set it down again, held it in her hand until the edge of the card cut into her palm. Then she put it back in the drawer, shut it, and curled up on the bed in the dark, eyes open, not sleeping, listening to the soft sounds of Soren moving around in the living room with one arm and a bandaged shoulder, planning how to save what was left of his empire. And she lay there empty-handed, trapped between 3 forces, none of them on her side, wondering whether her brother would still be alive by the time she figured out her next move. The morning after the night, she screamed in Soren's face. Brielle stepped into the living room and found him seated at the dining table, his phone face down, his coffee untouched, his eyes fixed on the window. His left shoulder was still bandaged, his arm still in the sling, his face gray with lack of sleep. She sat across from him, no greeting, no apology for the night before. She spoke plainly. I have a plan. Soren turned and looked at her. She continued. Corbin thinks I'm a stupid hostage. You said that in the first week, that it was the only advantage I had. Then use it. I go see Corbin, pretend I'm surrendering, beg him to release Holden. Tell him I'm willing to cooperate. He's arrogant. He'll talk. And I'll record everything. Soren looked at her for 10 seconds without blinking. Then he spoke, his voice flat, but slower than usual. No, this isn't the moment for you to say no to me. You walk into Corbin's territory alone, unarmed, with no backup. If he gets suspicious, you don't come back out. He won't be suspicious. He thinks I'm a frightened nurse looking for my brother. And he's right. I am a frightened nurse looking for my brother. I just won't let him see the rest of me." The silence stretched. Soren looked at her, looked at the way she sat upright, her hands resting flat on the table, her eyes steady. She didn't look like the woman who had screamed in the middle of the living room the night before. She looked like someone who had spent the entire night awake, crushing every option in her hands, and choosing the most dangerous one because it was the only one left. He drew in a breath and let it out. "If you do this, you wear a recording device. Small, hidden inside your clothes. Corbin doesn't search women because he doesn't see women as a threat. You let it run from the moment you walk in until the moment you walk out." Brielle nodded. Soren went on, his voice sharper now. "You don't ask about Holden directly at first. You let him talk. Arrogant men talk when they think they're safe. You cry if you need to. You beg if you need to. You let him feel like he's won. That's when he gets careless." He stopped and looked at her straight on. "And if at any point you feel unsafe, any second, you stand up and leave. No evidence is worth your life. Do you hear me?" She nodded again. He trained her for the next 2 hours. How to read body language. How a man leaning forward means he wants control. How fingers touching the face mean he is weighing a move. How eyes shifting to the right mean he is searching for a lie. How to let her voice shake just enough to sound believable, but not enough to raise suspicion. How to make her eyes look wet without actually crying. She listened, memorized, and realized that he was teaching her the very thing he used every day. The art of controlling other people by letting them believe they were the ones in control. That afternoon, Soren handed her a tiny recording device no bigger than the tip of a finger, clipped to the inside of her collar. She wore an old sweater, jeans, no makeup, her hair tied loosely back. She looked exactly like the desperate nurse coming to beg a powerful man to spare her brother. Because that was exactly what she was. She had only hidden a recording chip beneath her collar. Soren gave her the address of the restaurant Corbin had taken in Canton, one of the 3 front businesses Corbin had ripped away from him. She took a taxi there alone, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears for the full 20-minute ride. The restaurant was closed to the public, a private event sign hanging in the window. She knocked. One of Corbin's men opened the door, looked her up and down, then led her inside. Corbin Voss sat at the last table, leaning back in his chair, a glass of wine in his hand, 2 men standing behind him. He looked exactly as Brielle had imagined from everything she knew. 40 years old, sharp, featured, eyes half-lidded in the way of a man assessing everything around him at once. Gray suit, closely cut hair, a thin smile that never reached his eyes. He looked at her, and that smile widened. She was precisely what he expected. A small woman with red-rimmed eyes, come to beg. "Miss Ashford." "Sit down." Brielle sat. She let her shoulders sag, let her voice tremble, let her eyes turn wet. "I came for Holden. I'll do anything. Please." Corbin leaned forward, set down his wineglass, and began to talk. Exactly as Soren had predicted, he talked too much. He talked about Markov, about the deal to reopen the shipping route through the Eastern Harbor, about the plan to use the 3 restaurants he had seized as laundering points for the new flow of goods. He talked about Holden as if he were talking about an object in storage. The kid's still breathing. For now he's still useful. He gave the place where Holden was being held, an apartment in the industrial district in the south, 2 guards. He told her everything because, in his eyes, Brielle was no one at all. She sat there listening, nodding, crying in the right moments, shaking in the right places, while the device under her collar recorded every word. When she felt she had enough, she stood, thanked him in a choked voice, and turned to leave. But Corbin was faster than she expected. His hand shot out and caught her wrist, not hard enough to bruise right away, but firm enough for her to feel the force of it. She stopped, didn't jerk away, didn't turn immediately. Her heart was pounding so hard she was afraid he could hear it. "You know," Corbin said, his voice low, his mouth close to her ear. "Cade always liked keeping beautiful things for himself. I don't keep them. I use them." Brielle turned and looked at him, her face smooth now, her eyes still red but no longer trembling. She pulled her hand back, slow and deliberate, not with a violent yank, because yanking meant fear. And fear was exactly what Corbin wanted to see. "I came here on my own. I leave on my own." Then she walked out, past the men guarding the door, outside, and into the taxi waiting at the curb. The taxi door shut. The car pulled away, and Brielle's hands began to shake. Not a light tremor, but shaking so hard she had to lock both hands together and press them down against her thighs so the driver wouldn't notice. Her wrist still burned where Corbin had grabbed it, and that last thing he said kept turning in her head like a shard of broken glass. But in her jacket pocket, the recording device was still running, and on it was everything she needed. Brielle made it back to the penthouse at 7 that evening, and her hands were still shaking. Soren was standing in the living room, not sitting, waiting. He watched her come through the door, and she saw his eyes move from her face down to her hands in a single second, checking whether she had come back in one piece. She didn't say anything. She went straight to the kitchen table, unclipped the recording device from inside her collar, and set it on the surface. Everything's on here. The deal with Markov, the plan for the shipping route through the Eastern Harbor, the 3 restaurants they're using to launder money, and where they're holding Holden, the apartment in the Southern Industrial District. 2 guards. Soren picked up the device, plugged it into his laptop, and played the audio file. Corbin's voice filled the penthouse, confident, arrogant, talking about Markov and the new flow of goods, as if he were giving a presentation in a boardroom. Soren listened to the whole thing without interrupting, his face unreadable. When the file ended, he gave one slow nod. Enough. 1 word. But the way he said it told Brielle that she had brought back something he couldn't have gotten for himself. She had walked into his enemy's territory, sat across from the man who wanted to sell her, played the role Soren had taught her to play, and brought back evidence strong enough to destroy Corbin from the inside. He closed the laptop, turned to look at her, and that was when his gaze stopped on her wrist. The red marks where Corbin had grabbed her were still there, plain beneath the kitchen light, the shape of 4 fingers pressed into pale skin. She saw Soren's jaw tighten, the muscles at his temples jump, his right hand closing into a fist against the table. But he didn't say anything. He didn't ask what Corbin had done. He didn't promise revenge. He didn't say any of the things men say in movies when they see bruises on a woman's arm. He only stood, walked to the liquor cabinet, took out the bottle of whiskey she had seen opened only once in 3 weeks, and poured 2 glasses. He set one in front of her, the first drink he had ever poured for her. Then he sat down in the chair beside her. Not across from her the way he always sat at meals, but beside her, on the same side of the table, closer than he had been at any point since she first entered the penthouse. He didn't touch her, but he sat close enough that she could feel the heat from his right arm, only inches from her left. Brielle picked up the glass and took a drink. The whiskey burned down her throat, and she closed her eyes for 2 seconds, feeling the heat spread through her chest. When she opened them again, Soren was looking at the whiskey in his own hand, turning it slowly, the kitchen light glinting through the glass. The silence stretched between them, but it wasn't the heavy silence of those first days. It was the silence of 2 people who had already gone through enough together that they no longer needed words to fill the air. Then Soren spoke, his voice low, directed forward instead of toward her, as if looking at her while saying this would make it impossible to say it all. When my father died, I was 27. Heart attack. Died at the breakfast table, face down in a plate of eggs. Didn't have time to say anything. Didn't have time for final words. He ruled for 30 years and died like an ordinary man. He stopped and took a drink. I inherited everything, not because I wanted it, because there was no one else. Corbin was the right hand, but Corbin wasn't blood. And in this world, blood is the only thing that transfers power without a vote. He turned the glass one more slow circle. For the first 3 years, I drank. Not like this. 1 glass on a Saturday night. I drank until my underground doctor, the one who stitched up bullet wounds for the men in the organization, had to pull me off the bathroom floor twice. Silence. Brielle didn't look at him. She looked straight ahead, the whiskey glass in her hand, and listened. Twice, Soren repeated, his voice dry. The first time I mixed alcohol with sleeping pills. The second time I sat in the car with the garage door shut and the engine running. The doctor broke the door open and dragged me out. Said if he'd been 10 minutes later, there wouldn't have been a reason to drag me anywhere. She listened, her stomach tightening, but she still said nothing. She didn't say, "I'm sorry," because sorry meant nothing against something that had already happened. She didn't say, "I understand," because she didn't. She had never stood where he stood. Soren went on, more slowly now. After the second time, the doctor asked me why I was still here. I didn't have an answer. Then I thought, if I die, Corbin takes over. and Corbin reopens the drugs, reopens everything my father ran that I cut out. Families like the Morrisons keep dying. I didn't stay alive for myself. I stayed alive because if I died, whatever replaced me would be worse. He finished the rest of his whiskey and set the glass down on the table. I stayed because the worst way to make amends is to die before you've fixed anything. The sentence fell into the space between them and stayed there, heavy, not fading. Brielle looked down at her own glass, still half full. She drank the rest in a single swallow. The whiskey burned, but she didn't flinch. Then she poured more for both of them without asking, the same way she had made breakfast once without being asked. She didn't say you're brave. She didn't say you're strong. She didn't say any of the things he didn't need to hear. She only sat beside him, on the same side of the table, close enough that the warmth of their bodies touched even though their skin didn't, and drank with him until the whiskey bottle was a third empty. Outside the 14th floor window, Baltimore glowed in the cold night. Inside the penthouse, the two of them sat side by side, without speaking, without touching, but closer than any physical distance could measure, because the closest two people can come isn't when they touch. It's when one of them lays out the darkest thing inside them, and the other doesn't walk away. Soren moved within 24 hours of getting the recording. No waiting, no strategy meetings, no further weighing of options. He made 4 phone calls in the night from his office. The door shut, but Brielle could still hear his voice through the wall, low, even, cold, the voice of a man handing out sentences. The next morning he told her the plan, briefly, without asking her opinion, because this was his territory. He sent the audio file to 4 Allied bosses along the East Coast, men who had shared territory and quiet agreements with the Cade Syndicate since his father's time. The file held enough to tear everything open. Corbin's voice bragging about his private deal with Markov, about reopening the shipping route through the Eastern Harbor without clearing it with anyone, about using the 3 restaurants he had seized to launder money for the new flow of goods, about breaking the territorial agreement that 5 organizations had maintained for 15 years. But the killing blow wasn't the deal with Markov. It was the money. Soren had his people audit the books of the 3 restaurants Corbin had taken and discovered that Corbin had been skimming shared money from the organization for 18 months, transferring it into private offshore accounts. Not just Soren's money. Money from the whole network. Money the Allied bosses had a stake in too. Corbin hadn't only betrayed Soren. He had stolen from everyone. The reaction came within 12 hours. 2 bosses in Philadelphia and 1 in Wilmington cut off contact with Corbin immediately. Markov, more practical than any of them, looked at the missing money, looked at 4 organizations turning their backs, and decided Corbin was no longer an asset but a liability. He pulled his support, shut down the Eastern Harbor, and severed every agreement. Within 48 hours, Corbin Voss went from the man on the verge of overthrowing Soren Cade to a man with no one left behind him. No money, no allies, no territory. Brielle watched it all unfold, from the penthouse through the fragments of information Soren gave her, and the calls she overheard through the wall. She saw the pieces falling, one after another, and she knew the recording she had brought back was the first domino. But she also knew Corbin Voss wasn't the kind of man who lost without leaving scorch marks behind. On the afternoon of the 2nd day, Soren got a message. From Corbin. Short. I lost. Come take the boy back. Address in the Southern Industrial District. Building C, 2nd floor. And the final line. I left you a gift. Soren read the message, read it again, then made a call. He sent 4 of the men still loyal to him, led by a man named Maddox, 35 years old. One of the men who had been with Soren since the first year after he inherited everything. Maddox was the only man within the organization whom Soren addressed with such quiet, personal respect, a bond forged over 9 years of loyalty. Brielle wanted to go with them. Soren said no. You wait here. If everything goes well, I bring Holden back. If it doesn't, you need to be somewhere safe. She wanted to argue, but she looked at the white bandage on his shoulder, looked at the way he stood leaning slightly to the right because the left still hurt, and she understood that he wasn't going either. He stayed in the penthouse, his shoulder not healed, giving orders through the phone, and waiting. Waiting with her. The 2 of them sat in the living room without speaking, without reading, without doing anything at all. Just waiting. Soren's phone rang at 6 in the evening. He picked it up, listened, and Brielle saw his face change, not collapse, harden, every line of it freezing like concrete, jaw clenched, eyes closing for 3 seconds before opening again. He set the phone down and looked at her. Holden is alive. Beaten badly, but alive. My men are taking him to an underground hospital. Brielle let out a breath, and her whole body went soft, as though someone had just pulled every bone from inside her. Holden was alive. 6 months of searching. 3 weeks in this penthouse. 1 bullet. 1 hidden recorder. And her brother was alive. But Soren wasn't finished. He kept speaking, his voice flat, but slower now, heavier. Corbin rigged the apartment with an improvised bomb. Timed. Maddox went in first, saw Holden tied to the chair, cut him loose, yelled for everyone to get out. The bomb went off while Maddox was still at the door. He stopped. Maddox didn't make it out. Brielle looked at him, and it took 3 seconds for the words to settle in. Maddox. The man who led the way in. The man Soren called by his first name. Dead, because he had gone in to save her brother. How old was he? She asked, not even knowing why that was the first thing she said. 35. Wife. 2-year-old daughter. The living room fell so silent, Brielle could hear the hum of the air system, the wind against the windows, the sound of her own heartbeat. A man of 35 with a 2-year-old little girl had just died because he walked into the room where her brother was being held. Holden lived because Maddox died. The arithmetic was simple and brutal enough to make her feel sick. Soren didn't say anything else. He sat on the sofa, his right hand on his thigh, his left shoulder wrapped white beneath his shirt, staring out the window. His face didn't break. He didn't cry. He didn't shake. It only hardened to the point that Brielle knew something inside him was splitting. Maddox had been with him for 9 years. 9 years, and Soren called him by name. And now he sat here in this cold penthouse alone with that news. Brielle didn't know what to say. There was nothing to say. She stood, went into the kitchen, boiled water, made coffee, and set a cup in front of him. Not because coffee could fix anything, because it was the only thing she knew how to do when there was nothing else left to do. Soren looked at the cup of coffee, then at her. He didn't thank her. He only gave the smallest nod, almost too slight to see. Then he turned back toward the window. Victory. Corbin had lost. Holden was alive. But Maddox was dead. And in the penthouse on the 14th floor, victory tasted like nothing but ash. The underground hospital was in the basement beneath an abandoned veterinary clinic in Pigtown, South Baltimore. Soren drove Brielle there in the black car the next morning, saying little on the way, only one sentence when the car stopped. Take whatever time you need. I'll wait outside. Brielle stepped out, went through the steel door, down the concrete stairs, and into a room lit by fluorescent lights that smelled of antiseptic. Holden lay on a metal bed, a white blanket pulled up to his chest. Thinner than the video, thinner than anything she had imagined through those 6 months. His cheekbones jutted sharp beneath gray skin. His eyes had sunk deep into bruised black hollows, and the hand resting outside the blanket was so thin she could count every knuckle. His lips were cracked. A bruise along his chin had turned yellow with age. And across his forehead ran a long cut closed with 7 stitches. But he was breathing. His chest rose and fell, slow and steady, alive. Brielle stood in the doorway for 3 seconds, looking at her brother, and everything she had held inside for 6 months broke apart. She went to the bed, dropped to her knees, wrapped both arms around that gaunt body, and cried. Not softly, not the silent kind of crying she had taught herself to survive with. She cried until her shoulders shook, until her breath broke apart, until her tears soaked the shoulder of Holden's hospital gown. 6 months. 6 months of searching. 6 months without crying because crying was a luxury when your brother was missing. 6 months of swallowing everything down until her chest had hardened like concrete. Now the concrete cracked, and everything came pouring out, beyond control. Holden didn't hold her back. His arms lay still at his sides, never lifting, never answering the embrace. When Brielle finally let go, wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, and looked at his face, she saw the thing she had not prepared herself to face. Holden wasn't looking at her. His eyes were lowered, fixed on the blanket, on his hands, on anywhere except his sister's face. And on that gaunt face there wasn't relief, wasn't joy, but anger. Why did you come here? His voice was hoarse, weak, but sharp. Brielle blinked. What did you say? Why did you look for me? You knew who those people were. You knew what they do. And you still walked straight into it. Are you insane? She looked at her brother, trying to understand. Then she did. Holden wasn't angry because she had come too late. He was angry because she had come at all. Angry because she had put herself in danger, been chained in a warehouse, beaten, lived in a Mafia boss's penthouse, walked into Corbin's territory, all because of him. And that anger, Brielle realized, wasn't really anger at her. It was anger at himself, wrapped in a hard shell and thrown outward because Holden didn't know how to say, "I'm sorry I dragged you into this hell." "You don't get to be angry at me for looking for you," Brielle said, her voice level, the voice of a nurse speaking to a difficult patient. "I'm all you have left, and you're all I have left." Holden said nothing. His jaw tightened, his eyes still lowered. Then the anger melted, slowly, like ice under sunlight, and beneath it was the thing Brielle feared seeing more than anger: shame. Holden was ashamed to the point that his whole body curled in on itself in the bed, shoulders hunched, head bowed, hands clutching the blanket. Ashamed of the debt, of the gambling, of disappearing, of making his sister sell everything and throw herself into the underworld to find him. Ashamed of all of it, but he couldn't say it. The apology was stuck in his throat like a fishbone, too large to swallow, too sharp to pull out. Brielle sat on the edge of the bed, looked at him, and asked the question she needed to ask, even though she knew the answer might break her. "Can you stop? The gambling. Can you stop?" Holden was silent, a long silence, long enough for the monitor beside the bed to beep 4 times, 5 times, 6 times. Then he spoke, his voice small, fractured. "I'll try. Not I'll stop. I'll try." 3 words, and Brielle heard everything hidden inside them. Holden hadn't stopped. Maybe he had never truly stopped. The addiction was still there, still living inside his head. Even now, when he was little more than bone on a hospital bed after 6 months in captivity, she had found her brother. But the brother she found was not the one she remembered. Not the 19-year-old kid carrying trays in a restaurant, grinning wide when he got a tip, saying, "Hey sis, I'll cook for you tomorrow." The man lying in front of her now was 22, carrying addiction in his blood, shame on his shoulders, and no idea how to apologize to the one person in the world who still cared whether he lived or died. She bent down and kissed his forehead, lightly. Holden closed his eyes, and she saw his lashes turn wet. He didn't cry out loud. They only filled. Then he turned his face away. She stood, said, "I'll come back tomorrow," then walked out. On the drive back to the penthouse, she sat in silence, watching Baltimore slide by through the window. Soren drove with one hand and didn't ask anything. He knew without asking. Some things are written more clearly on a face than in words. When they got back to the penthouse, Brielle stepped into the living room and stopped. Soren was sitting at the piano. The lid was open. The dust had been wiped away. Someone had cleaned it while she was at the hospital. Maybe him. One-handed. The fingers of his right hand rested on the keys, then pressed a single note. The sound rang through the empty penthouse, clear and sad, vibrating for 2 seconds before fading, then silence. He didn't play another note, just one, as though he wanted to hear whether the piano was still alive, or whether he was. Brielle walked over and sat down on the piano bench beside him, on his left, on the side of the bandaged shoulder. She didn't speak, didn't ask, didn't touch him. She only sat there. The 2 of them sat in front of the piano on the 14th floor penthouse, one having just lost the most loyal man he had, the other having found her brother again only to realize she no longer recognized him. Neither of them spoke. The single note had died long ago, but its echo still lingered there, in the air, in the narrow space between her shoulder and his, in the truth that sometimes sitting beside someone in silence is all 2 people have left to give each other. 3 days after Holden was taken to the underground hospital, Brielle went out to buy food for her brother. She was carrying the bag and walking back toward the car when a black sedan pulled up tight against the curb and the back door opened. Diane Purcell stepped out, no polite gray blazer this time like before, just a black coat, a hard face, and eyes with no patience left in them. "Get in the car, Miss Ashford, or we can talk right here on the sidewalk. Your choice which one you prefer." Brielle didn't get in. She set the bag of food down on the step outside the nearest store, leaned back against the brick wall, and folded her arms. If Purcell wanted to talk, then they would talk here. She wasn't climbing into an FBI car to have a conversation inside a space they controlled. A lesson she had learned from 3 weeks of living with Soren. Never step onto someone else's ground unless you have to. Purcell stood in front of her, 1 step away, her voice low enough that passers-by wouldn't hear. I know about the explosion in the Southern Industrial District. 1 man dead. I know Corbin Voss disappeared from Baltimore 2 days ago. I know your brother is lying in the basement of a veterinary clinic in Pigtown. Brielle kept her face flat, but her insides twisted. Purcell even knew about the underground hospital. The FBI had been watching more closely than she realized. Purcell went on, her voice no longer carrying the polite invitation of that first meeting in the coffee shop. For 3 years, I've been building a RICO case against the Cade Syndicate. 3 years of patience. 3 years of surveillance. 3 years of warrant requests getting denied because I didn't have enough evidence from the inside. Then you show up, living in Cade's home, coming and going freely, right there when Corbin fell apart. You have what I need. And last time I asked politely. This time I'm not asking. She straightened, her eyes sharp as a blade. Full cooperation. Everything you know about Soren Cade, the organization, the money flow, the restaurants, the personnel. Or, I prosecute you as an accomplice. You live in his house. You stitched up one of his men. You were present in the chain of events that led to a death in the industrial district. I have enough to open a file on you, and you know I do. Brielle listened to every word and felt the weight of them pressing down on her chest. Purcell wasn't bluffing. She had enough. Living with Soren, stitching up Remy, knowing about the rescue of Holden, all of it could be twisted into complicity if the FBI wanted it badly enough. And Purcell did. 3 years of patience wasn't meant to end with scraps. But Brielle wasn't the girl chained in the warehouse 3 weeks ago anymore. She looked at Purcell, and in her mind the plan was already there. Formed the night before when she lay awake after coming back from the underground hospital, staring at the ceiling and turning every piece on the board over and over. She spoke slowly and clearly. I'll give you information on Corbin Voss and Yevgeny Markov, the drug deal through the Eastern Harbor, the shipping operation, the offshore accounts Corbin used to siphon money. Enough for you to prosecute Corbin and open a case on Markov. 2 major targets, enough for your 3 years of patience to produce something. Purcell lifted an eyebrow. What about Cade? Cade isn't part of the deal. You don't decide who is part of the deal, Miss Ashford. You're right. I don't decide. But I have this. Brielle took out her phone and played an audio file. Purcell's own voice came from the small speaker, clear and sharp. Full cooperation or I prosecute you as an accomplice. Then, I have enough to open a file on you, and you know I do. Brielle stopped the recording. Purcell stood still, her face unchanged, but her eyes narrowed by a single fraction. Brielle continued, her voice level, not shaking. You're coercing a witness without counsel present. You're threatening prosecution to force cooperation. I'm not a lawyer, but I know enough to understand that this file has value if it reaches the right hands. If you come back and pressure me again, that file goes to an attorney before you make it back to your office. Silence. Purcell looked at her for a long time, the kind of stare Brielle had learned how to endure after spending 3 weeks facing Soren Cade's eyes every day. No blinking, no retreat, no tremor. Then Purcell spoke, her voice low, slow, each word heavier than the one before it. Do you know what you're becoming? That question wasn't a threat. It was a real warning. Purcell looked at her the way someone looks at another person crossing a line, without knowing whether there will be a path back. Brielle answered without needing to think, because the answer had been living inside her since the night she stitched Soren's gunshot wound. I'm surviving. Purcell nodded once, slowly. Not agreement, acknowledgement. Then she turned away, got back into the car, and shut the door. The black sedan slid off into Baltimore traffic and disappeared. Brielle stood on the sidewalk, phone still in her hand, watching the car vanish at the end of the street. Then she looked down at her own hand. It was shaking. Not with fear, shaking because she had just realized the thing Purcell had seen before she did. She had recorded the meeting, not because she thought of it that morning. She had prepared the night before, setting her phone to record and keeping it hidden but accessible before leaving the penthouse. She had made a plan, calculated the move ahead, prepared a defense before her opponent struck. She had played it exactly the way Soren had taught her, controlling another person by letting them think they were the one in control, then overturning the board with a hidden piece. She was thinking like him, and she didn't know whether that was victory or loss. She picked up the bag of food from the step, straightened, and walked away. But all the way back to the penthouse, Purcell's question kept sounding in her head without stopping. Do you know what you're becoming? And she had no answer except the sound of her own footsteps on the cold sidewalk. 2 weeks later, Holden was strong enough to stand, walk, and eat without an IV. Brielle went to the underground hospital every day, bringing food, changing bandages, checking his numbers like a nurse rather than a sister, because that was the only way she could stay calm while looking at him. Holden didn't say much during those 2 weeks. He ate, slept, stared at the wall, and sometimes looked at her with an expression she couldn't read, half wanting to say something, half swallowing it back down. She didn't push. She had learned that pushing someone to speak before they were ready only made them close up harder. On the 15th day, Preacher Merritt appeared, 60 years old, gray-haired, shoulders slightly bent, walking into the underground hospital with an old leather briefcase like a lawyer visiting a client in prison. Merritt was the man Soren called when he needed to turn someone into somebody else on paper. He opened the briefcase in front of Holden, and inside was a new identity, a new name, a new social security number, a new passport, a new driver's license, a new bank card. Holden Ashford disappeared. In his place stood a 22-year-old man with a different name, a clean history, no debt, no criminal record, no trace linking him to the Cade Syndicate or Baltimore. Merritt explained it briefly. An inpatient rehab program in Portland, Oregon, 30 days residential, then 6 months of outpatient support. A one-way plane ticket, tomorrow morning, from a private airport to avoid the cameras at commercial terminals. Holden listened, nodded, asked nothing. He looked at Brielle, then looked down, still didn't speak. The next morning, Brielle stood at a private airfield outside Baltimore, the December wind slicing through the coat Soren had bought her the week before. A small plane sat on the concrete runway, the propellers still. Holden stood in front of her, a new backpack slung over his shoulder, new clothes on his body, hair cut short, looking different and yet still thin, still pale, still carrying the look of a man not yet used to the idea that he was allowed to begin again. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and for the first time in 2 weeks, Holden spoke. "You don't have to stay because of me anymore." Brielle blinked. The words hit the one place inside her she hadn't defended, because they were true. For 6 months, the only reason she had stayed upright was finding Holden. Now Holden was standing here, alive, about to board a plane to Portland. That reason was over, and she hadn't yet thought about what would hold her upright after that. Holden looked down, swallowed, then spoke again, his voice breaking in the middle of the sentence, the kind of break no one could fake. "I'm sorry. I know saying that isn't enough. It'll never be enough, but I'm sorry." Brielle looked at her brother, the 22-year-old boy standing in front of her, all bone and guilt, saying the 3 words it had taken him 2 weeks to force past his throat. She didn't answer, "It's okay," because it wasn't okay. She didn't answer, "I forgive you," because she still didn't know whether she did. She only stepped forward, wrapped her arms around him, held him tightly, her arms around his thin back, her chin against his shoulder, and stayed that way until the pilot called him to board. Then she let go. Holden turned away, climbed the steps into the plane, and didn't look back. The door shut. The propellers spun. The plane rolled down the runway, lifted into the gray Baltimore sky, grew smaller and smaller, then disappeared. Brielle stood on the airfield until the sound of the engine faded completely, and only the wind remained. Then she got into the car and went back to the penthouse. The elevator carried her up to the 14th floor. The doors opened. The penthouse was empty. Soren wasn't home, but on the kitchen table, placed in the center, exactly where she usually sat, was a thick brown envelope and a folded note. She opened the envelope first. Inside were papers Merritt had prepared, just like Holden's set, but bearing her name. A new identity, a new passport, a new driver's license, a bank card with confirmation of a $50,000 balance, and a one-way plane ticket with no destination printed on it, an open ticket, anywhere, anytime, freedom, complete, unconditional freedom, lying inside a brown envelope on the kitchen table. She opened the note, Soren's handwriting, neat and slanted, the same as the note he had left for her the first morning she woke in the penthouse. But this time it wasn't the location of the first aid kit. "You don't owe me anything. You never did." 12 words. She read them twice, then a third time. Then she set the note down and looked around the penthouse. Empty. Clean. His coffee cup had been washed and left upside down on the drying rack. His office door was closed. His coat wasn't hanging by the door. He had gone. Deliberately. She understood at once, as clearly as reading a page. Soren wasn't home because he didn't want his face to become the reason she stayed. He didn't want her to look at him and choose to remain out of feeling instead of reason. He had left the envelope, left the note, left the penthouse empty, and gone so that this decision would be entirely hers. No one standing across from her forcing her to choose. Not Corbin, not Purcell, not Soren. Only her, the brown envelope, and the silent penthouse. Brielle sat down in the chair, one hand resting on the envelope, looking at the piano whose lid was still open from the day she had sat beside him, looking at the bookshelves, looking at the sofa where she had draped a blanket over him the night he came home shot, looking at the kitchen table where she had first set a plate of eggs in front of him. And she realized that the hardest decision wasn't whether to stay or leave. It was knowing that no matter what she chose, she was going to lose something. Brielle sat at the kitchen table for a long time, her hand resting on the brown envelope, her thumb turning the penthouse key Soren had given her a week earlier. He hadn't handed it to her directly, only set it on the kitchen counter, the way he gave her everything, without pressure, without explanation, simply leaving it there. She remembered the moment she picked it up, looked at him, and he only nodded before turning back to his laptop. He didn't say, "This is your home." He didn't say, "You belong here." Only the key, and the right to choose. She stood and moved slowly through the living room. The piano lid was open, the white keys bright beneath the afternoon light slanting through the glass. The dust gone since the day she sat beside him. The bookshelves covered the wall. Philosophy, history, economics. The books she had borrowed and read on the sofa every night, while he sat at the other end. The gray sofa, 3 cushions, the distance between them each evening shrinking little by little without either of them ever naming it. The 14th floor windows looked out over Baltimore, the city she had come to as a desperate woman, and was now about to leave as someone else. She looked at the kitchen table, the place where she had set that first plate of eggs in front of him, that morning when he sat across from her with surprise in his eyes, hidden carefully but not well enough to escape her. She looked at the sofa, where she had draped a blanket over him the night he came home shot, then sat across from him guarding his breathing until morning, without knowing exactly why she was doing it. She looked down the hallway, leading to her room, the room with the unlocked door, where she had slept for 3 weeks with her shoes on at first, then gradually taken them off, turned out the light, and finally slept for real. Every corner of this penthouse carried a fragment of the 3 weeks she had never imagined she would survive. She returned to the kitchen table, set the key down, right beside the brown envelope. Then she took paper and a pen from the kitchen drawer, sat, and wrote. Not long. It didn't need to be long. I'm going to Portland. Holden needs someone. After that, I don't know yet. But I'm leaving the key here not because I'm giving it back, because I know you'll open the door if I come back. She placed the note on the table and waited one corner with the key. Then she picked up the envelope, stood, and looked around the penthouse one last time. She didn't look back a second time. She stepped into the elevator, the doors closed, 14 floors down to the lobby, out to the street, into a taxi. Baltimore fell away behind the window, slowly, then disappeared. That evening, Soren returned to the penthouse at 7. Later than usual because he had spent 2 hours driving in circles through the city, going nowhere, only driving, giving her enough time. He opened the door, switched on the light, and saw the penthouse empty. Empty in a way that was different from before she had come. Before, empty had been normal. Now empty meant something missing. He saw the key on the kitchen table first, small, silver, lying across the corner of a white note. He walked over, picked up the key, let it sit in his palm, then lifted the note. Read it again. Every word she had written, he read slowly, as though he were afraid that if he read too fast, the words would disappear. I know you'll open the door if I come back. He folded the note carefully, once, then again. Then he went into his office, opened the drawer, and placed the note inside, right beside the old photograph she had turned face up the night the power went out and he had never turned face down again. 2 things in the drawer. The photograph of the Morrison family, proof of the guilt he had carried for 22 years, and Brielle's note, proof that someone had seen everything he was, the dark and the light, the shattered store and the breakfast no one asked for, the bullet in his shoulder and the single piano note, and hadn't run. He closed the drawer and walked back into the living room. The piano stood in the corner, lid open, white keys reflecting the city lights through the glass. He sat down on the piano bench, on the right side, the side of the uninjured shoulder. The left side was empty, where she had sat that day. He placed his right hand on the keys, then his left, his shoulder aching, but he didn't stop, And for the first time in years, Soren Cade played the piano. Not a full piece, not a performance, only notes returning beneath his fingers, slow, broken apart, then gradually finding each other again like someone relearning how to walk after forgetting. The sound moved through the empty penthouse, from wall to wall, from floor to ceiling, filling the space that for 3 weeks had been filled with the smell of eggs in the morning, with silence on the sofa, with the sound of a needle piercing skin at 1 a.m. He played, and the penthouse wasn't empty anymore, not because she was there, because she had been there, and the mark of that didn't vanish simply because she stepped into an elevator. Outside the 14th floor windows, Baltimore glowed in the December night, cold but alive. And inside the penthouse of the loneliest mafia boss in the city, piano music flowed out, light, slow, imperfect, but alive. Like everything those two people had given each other. Not perfect, but real. The story of Brielle and Soren reminds us that sometimes trust doesn't begin with promises, but with small acts repeated day after day. That love doesn't always mean staying together. Sometimes it means letting the other person go because that's what they need. That human beings aren't perfect, aren't pure, but the choices we make each day are what define who we are. And that in this life, the bravest person isn't the one who feels no fear, but the one who is afraid and still keeps moving, still keeps believing, still keeps loving, even while knowing that love always comes with risk. If this story touched your heart, please hit the like button so we'll know, and share this video with the people you love, because somewhere out there someone may need to hear that it's never too late to begin again. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to hear more compelling stories every day. We'd truly love to hear what you think, how this story felt to you, whether it stirred anything in your real life, whether you've ever had to make the difficult choice between staying and leaving. Please share your thoughts in the comments below so we can hear what lies deepest in your heart. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and days filled with peace and calm. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.